We are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Mark Rudd. From 1965 to 1968, Mark Rudd was a student activist and organizer in the Columbia University chapter of Students for a Democratic Society, also known as SDS. He was one of the leaders of the spring 1968 occupation of 5 buildings and the subsequent strike against the university's complicity with war and its racism. After being kicked out of Columbia, he became a full-time organizer for SDS, where he helped found the militant Weathermen faction, which had as its goal, quote, the violent overthrow of the government of the U.S. in solidarity with the struggles of the people of the world, end quote. Wanted on federal charges of bombing and conspiracy, he was a fugitive from 1970 to 1977. Eventually, all the charges were dropped because of government illegalities. And he has captured this history in a new book titled Underground, My Life with SDS and the Weathermen. Start out and tell us, what was your motivation in writing your book, Underground, My Life with SDS and the Weathermen?
Well, for a long time, 25 years or more, I really hadn't said anything. But then in 2003, 2 things came together that really kind of knocked me out of my track. You know, I had put it behind me. I had very ambivalent feelings, extremely ambivalent, which I'll talk about in a second. But when the U.S. invaded Iraq, I joined the anti-war movement just like a lot of other people, and I saw Vietnam again. You know, then a few months later, this documentary movie came out, The Weather Underground. 2003. It was nominated for an Academy Award. Really good movie. I'm in it. And I actually was reluctant to be interviewed for it, but my wife said, you owe people, the people who helped you along the way, you owe them to know what you're thinking now. And so I didn't. I had done an interview in 1999 and forgotten about it. And then I saw this movie and I said, wow, see, what happened was, in the producers of the movie, 2 really great guys, Sam Green and Bill Siegel, young guys in their 30s, featured me in the movie. I was shocked, beginning, middle, end. At the end, there I am, this fat, middle-aged, gray-haired old guy, and I'm saying, gee, it's been, the whole thing's been bugging me for 30 years. What do we do with this knowledge? What does anybody do with this knowledge of who the U.S. is in the world? And then it cut to carpet bombing in Vietnam. And then there's me, 20-year-old me, skinny kid with the same look on my face, despair. And it really gets the audiences. So anyway, I got invited around to speak with the movie. And I found myself going to dozens of places and talking, question and answers, mostly discussion for the next few years, college campuses and theaters and it was cool, and young people wanted to know the story. So it kind of said to me, hey, there's something here that's important. Yeah.
Yeah, I know myself, I just had the faintest memory of the Weathermen from growing up. No
you look
details.
Too young, actually.
Yeah, exactly.
When were you born?
61.
Okay, so you were 7 years old, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So you just kind of hear about it peripherally and don't really know any details.
You might have been 9 years old You were 9 years old in 1970. So sure, a faint memory.
Yeah.
Most young people who saw the movie had never heard of the Weathermen. It was a total shock to them to see that there had been white, fairly privileged people who dedicated their lives to make a better world, but took some big risks.
Talk briefly about how did you get involved with politics in SDS?
Well, I was 18 years old in 1965. At the moment I went to college in the fall of 65, Columbia University. That was only a few months after the United States invaded Vietnam. Main force troops, very, very similar to 2003. And I hadn't thought too much about it. I went down the day I turned 18 and registered for the draft in June of '65, just a couple of months after the Marines invaded Vietnam. And when I got to Columbia, I found that there was already a significant number of people who were studying the war, trying to figure out what it was, and working to protest it, really organizing to get people out. And one day a guy knocks on my door, David Gilbert. He's featured in my book, but he's also in the movie. He's now in prison for the rest of his life. Great guy. And he says, what have you thought of? I'm from the Independent Committee on Vietnam. It was predecessor of SDS. And he said, what do you think about Vietnam? I said, I don't know. It doesn't sound too good to me. And we started talking. And he basically recruited me to SDS. And I found these really great people who were really, really, really sharp and passionate and felt that we could have an impact. And I fell in with them. That was my clique.
And how did that go from there to being involved with the takeover on Columbia University?
Years of work. I mean, these people, a lot of them were children of communists, socialists, labor people. They were what at the time was called red diaper babies. And they had a plan, which was organizing, which was get more people in, politicize, educate, research, get people to start thinking about themselves as political actors. And I joined with them, and I wanted to be like them. I wanted to be an organizer. And they had been organizing since at least 61 or 62 at Columbia. And I didn't even get there till 65, you know? And so we spent the next 3 years continuing that organizing, agitating about Vietnam, thinking a lot and talking a lot about racism and about national liberation throughout the world. See, the Cuban Revolution had just happened in '59. It wasn't that long after. But also Vietnam was critical because we started understanding. I started understanding. They had already been understanding the fact that Vietnam was a war of national liberation against the United States control. And I started understanding the United States as an imperial power in the world, or the biggest imperial power. And it didn't seem right to me. See, there was something that resonated with me. I'm Jewish, and I was born in '47, and I always thought about the Holocaust and World War II and Nazism, just my whole life, you know. And I thought, and I think a lot of people at the time, you know, it was only, I mean, I was born 2 years after the end of the war. You know, my father was in World War II, and my family had emigrated earlier in the century, but we had relatives in the camps, some of whom escaped, some didn't. And I knew the survivors. I always associated Nazism with racism because the Jews were the object of racism. And then the civil rights movement in the 50s and early 60s had set the tone for me of kind of skepticism of American mythology. You know, and also realizing that this is a racist society. Then when the war in Vietnam, when I started understanding the war in Vietnam, I saw it as a racist war and a war of conquest. I said, holy mackerel, these kids, the United States in Vietnam is not all that different from German military aggression. You know? And we are the Germans now. I don't want to be a good German. I don't want to acquiesce. I don't want to deny. I want to look at it in the face. The United States is murdering millions of people. I didn't want to be a good German, so I joined up.
So what was the motivation in breaking away or creating a new faction within the SDS known as the Weathermen.
Well, that actually is the second part of the book. The first part of my book, Underground, is about Columbia 65 to 68. And in April 68 was an enormous explosion at Columbia University that did not happen spontaneously. It was a result of many years' work, in which it was right after the Tet Offensive, the abdication of LBJ, said I wouldn't run again, which was a great victory for the anti-war movement, and then the murder of Martin Luther King on April 4th. Harlem, right next to Columbia, exploded. Fires, 25, 50, everywhere. I looked out over the Harlem from Columbia, which is on the heights, and you could see fires everywhere, smoke, sirens, wailing, people. It's amazing. And I jumped down the hill and ran around, the whole night, watching the whole thing. But everybody in the whole country, it was like kind of like 911, only more so, because everybody knew what the problem was. The problem was racism. And every white person had to think, what is our relationship to racism? What is the relationship of this institution to racism? And SDS and the local community had actually been developing the issue, the knowledge of awareness of the issue of Columbia's expansion into the Harlem community and throwing people out of their homes. It became symbolized in the building of a gym in public land in Morningside Park. And that plus the issue of Columbia's research, Defense Department research for the war. So everything came together, and I talk about this in detail in April 68, April 23rd. To April 30th, we occupied 5 buildings, one of them held by black students, which was very courageous of them because there were very few black students. They felt that they were the representatives of the Harlem community. It exploded. A few people started SDS and the Black Students Organization, Students Afro-American Society. We started a demonstration, and it grew and grew and grew, and the occupation grew, and finally we had well over 1,000 people in the buildings, and we held 5 buildings, and Columbia University called the police. They beat up hundreds of people and arrested 700, and then the whole university was out on strike, and it was the largest student uprising against the war and racism up to that time, and it set a model for the next few years. SDS, even the larger national organization, had a slogan, create 2, 3 many Columbias, which was takeoff on Che Guevara, create 2, 3 many Vietnams. The lesson, now I'm getting back to your question here. Is this okay to just kind of answer at length? The lesson was militancy works. The more militant you are, the more you'll attract more people because they'll see how serious you are. Unfortunately, it wasn't true, but we thought it was. Actually, what had happened was we had organized for years and we had laid the groundwork. And people had been thinking about Vietnam for years, students on the Columbia campus, and about racism. And the moment was right. It was like an incredibly combustible moment, perfect storm kind of situation. But in retrospect, years later, I realized it was the organizing that led to the explosion. It wasn't the militancy. But we raised this tactic of militancy to the level of a strategy. And we said everywhere, students and everybody, the anti-war movement has got to be more militant, and that will attract. It was a mistake because what happened was militancy itself gets you beat over the head, arrested, but it doesn't necessarily get people to join. What gets people to join is personal engagement. So, for the next year, I and a lot of other people, including right here in Seattle at the University of Washington, UW SDS was a militant action faction kind of a chapter, and things grew. Things did grow over it. Eventually, we formed a national faction within SDS called the Weathermen. It was after it had to do with a position paper we wrote, which we titled "You Don't Need a Weatherman to Know Which Way the Wind Blows," a line from Subterranean and Homesick Blues by Robert Zimmerman, and so we got the name Weatherman. And then there was another big fight. I mean, there's a lot of faction fights going on. And in the end of it all, in June of '69, my faction was in control of the national office and a number of the regional offices. And that's when things really started to go wrong. You want the rest of the story? Or you want to ask a question?
Keep going.
Okay, you don't mind this kind of...
No, this is good.
Okay. We said, we're going to fight. We're going to build a white fighting force to help the people of the world. We're not going to just let the Vietnamese fight alone or let the Black Panthers fight alone. We're going to be out there fighting too. And so we called for a major action called the National Action, later known as the Days of Rage, in October of '69 to coincide with the opening of the Chicago 8 conspiracy trial, which had referred back to significant arrests, Bobby Seale, Tom Hayden, Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, Dave Dellinger, a lot of other people, the Chicago 8, for organizing the 1968 demonstrations at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in '68. But this was already '69, and the trial was starting. Well, we expected thousands and thousands of young people to come, but instead maybe 400, maybe 500 came. It was actually fewer people than we started with in July, but in June, we didn't notice that, and hundreds of people got arrested and beat up. I got arrested and beat up. It's a whole business, broken arms, people were shot, we were fighting the Chicago cops. We wanted to prove how militant we were, and there's a lot of macho kind of, prove how tough you were. I wanted to be Che Guevara. I wanted to be a hero. Anyway, we then said, we had this central committee called the Weather Bureau. I was on it. I was one of the founders of this whole business. And we said, well, okay, it didn't work in the streets. Now this is what we've been waiting for. We have to go underground. We have to have an urban or a guerrilla army, a revolutionary army. It's a revolutionary moment. More and more young people will join us. Eventually, we'll hook up with the Panthers and the other non-white people, the colonized people inside this country. Vietnam is defeating the American military. There will be more defeats, 2-3 many Vietnams. U.S. imperialism is falling. Time to make war. It's kind of like a fantasy. Then there's lots of theories. I mean, we were intellectual kids, so we had, I write about all this stuff. The Foucault theory of Che Guevara. It's kind of a weird story, don't you think? Mm. It's also kind of intense too. But my book is sort of like the way I talk, so don't be scared of it. Anyway, we went underground, and we wanted to fight. We wanted to hit the government, the military. We wanted to make propaganda, armed propaganda, the highest level of struggle. We kind of had a cult of violence in a way, revolutionary violence, good violence. A small amount of violence stops a bigger amount of violence. The imperial system is a very violent system. Vietnam, remember, the whole backdrop of this is millions of people dying in Vietnam. United States carpet bombing the country, using chemical warfare throughout, dioxin. And so anyway, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, one of your mottos, I believe, was "Bring the war home."
Yes, exactly.
And so one of the ways you did that was through this bombing campaign.
Yeah. However, we weren't very good at it. One of the first bombs, or rather, three of the first bombs were being constructed in the basement of a house in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. These bombs were intended to be placed at a dance at a non-commissioned officers club, NCO, in Fort Dix, New Jersey. Innocent people would have died. This was the only moment when we really approached terrorism in a formal definition of attacking innocent people. Thank God the bombs did not go off at the target. It would have, killed innocent people, and it would have wrecked the anti-war movement. See, just to go back and make one point, we said the anti-war movement isn't enough. We need a revolutionary movement. It's not enough to just end this war, which in fact was what the Vietnamese wanted us to do, was have a broad anti-war movement, stop the war. But no, we knew better. We needed a revolutionary movement. It was a very arrogant kind of thing we were doing. Anyway, it would have wrecked the anti-war movement if the bombs had gone off. Fortunately, they went off prematurely, and they killed three of our own people, intimate friends of mine.
So what happened after that? The Weathermen continued to, or the Weather Underground continued to do bombings after that.
Yes, there was a kind of a retreat, though, from this like heavy military kind of view to kind of symbolic bombings, buildings that would talk about sort of be symbolic statements of repression. For example, when there was the revolt in Attica, New York, the prison revolt, bombing the corrections department in New York building, but calling it a warning, and somehow, luckily, no bombs that the Weather Underground, I think there might have been 25 or something, ever set off, ever killed anybody. Although some bombs. We weren't the only group doing that, and there were people kind of following our leadership, independent groups, and some bombs did kill people. So anyway, myself, this is part of the story. I started having a crisis of confidence, self-confidence, and belief, but I experienced it as my own weakness, and so I kind of demoted myself in the organization, starting from before the townhouse. And so for the next year, 1970 rather than the rest of the year, I kind of moved down in the organization until I became a foot soldier. And by the end of the year, I was out. I kind of removed myself. But I was still a fugitive. And I was still close to the organization. And it took me, I stayed underground until 1977.
So do you consider the Weather Underground a terrorist organization?
Yes, of course. But my definition of terrorism now is all violence is terrorism. I think the United States military is a much larger terrorist organization.
Because it carries out state-sponsored violence.
Right. Well, state violence is violence, and usually they try to minimize the view of the fact that they attack civilians by putting it into rhetoric like collateral damage, but they kill hundreds of thousands of civilians. We a low estimate came out yesterday of 110,000 Iraqis, but it's probably more like 500,000. And they say, well, that's a necessary cost of war. And besides, what is war but terror? What is violence? War is a system of terror, but since the state does it, we don't call it terrorism. No, I oppose all violence, revolutionary violence too. But state violence, which is much greater, I oppose. I'm willing to come clean about the fact that I got caught up in this violence of the time.
So talk about, you have since about, well, you said 2003, since the documentary came out.
Yeah.
You've been doing the talks around the country.
Yeah,
Talk
well,
about organizing and what good lessons you took out of the 60s.
Well, that's actually the point of the book in a way, although it's in the form of a story. The first section of the book, Organizing in Colombia, involves very traditional organizing. We inherited it from the civil rights movement and the labor movement. It's what built those movements and built probably all successful social movements of the 20th century. Personal engagement between people, talking to people who are not like you, building coalitions. The civil rights movement was an incredibly grand, humongous coalition of different kinds of people. It wasn't only poor black people, far from it. Church people, labor. I mean, you could go on about this history, but building a base, educating, getting people involved themselves, agitating to the point where people decide to become part of this large democratic movement. It takes time. Well, here in Seattle, you have a lot of experience with organizing. The WTO demonstrations and the IWW, the 1919 general strike. I mean, there's a lot of organizing that's still going on. But see, what happened in my story was we moved from organizing to self-expression. Self-expression saying, look how passionate I am. Look how militant I am. Look how much I care about this issue. And that's theater. But that doesn't touch people to themselves join. So the first part of the book is good organizing. The middle part of the book, the transition within SDS to Weatherman, is bad organizing. And the last part of the book is horrible organizing. That's the Weather Underground.
All right. So if there's a single message you could give out to people today, what would that be?
Organize. Figure out how to do it. Young people ask me all the time. I was at Seattle Central, and they asked me what they can do. I said, well, find other people who think like you. And also study historical movements. Find out how the civil rights movement was organized. Talk to people who have been in it. Read about it. There's great sources. I was just this morning thinking about a book, I've Got the Light of Freedom, by Charles M. Payne, Payne, in which he talks about how SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, organized in the town of Greenwood, Mississippi, from 1960 to 1964 for black people to regain their voting rights. That was almost a feudal, serf-like situation, just to step up from slavery. People were not educated. People did not own their own homes. They lived in shacks that were owned by the landowners. And yet, SNCC used these techniques, which were not that different from how black churches in the rural South were organized by women. They used these techniques. It's a great case history. And I was thinking, what can we learn from it? Well, personal engagement, friendship circles, social, continual talk, continual growth, and coalition building, and base building and coalition building.